Okay, and I'm ready when you are.
Great, you can get started.
Okay, everyone, welcome back to class. Again, this is Jay Cantrell, your teacher. We're going to be talking about, for this month, pretty much design ideas, concepts, and details. We're going to be really talking about what's called Beaux-Arts design today for the next hour. So, of course, you know, Beaux-Arts, I'm sure you've heard of the École de Beaux-Arts, the famous, incredible school in Paris. Then we'll talk about some of the paintings and then some of the architecture. But of course, Beaux-Arts design really means, of course, the beautiful arts. This was a school that was created roughly in the 1700s, founded by Cardinal Mazarin. And we're going to be looking at architectural styles and motifs and design strategies roughly between 1700 and 1800. Now, again, we just talked about neoclassical and Baroque architecture. So the Beaux-Arts design work is really for grandiose architecture, like the biggest, sort of most elaborate sort of architectural face you can kind of imagine. But before that, let's kind of look at, I just like to show, and Valerie, I think you can see these images. I like to show the construction of classical architecture. You know, this is a building, I think, in New York, but we're showing these unbelievable onyx classical columns being lifted into place. Now, this is, you know, technically neoclassical architecture using, there's a mixture of iron and steel to get the columns in place. But for the most part, you can see the scale and how these people actually build these things. Yeah, it's actually this is an image I got from Instagram, I think, or Pinterest. But, you know, it's interesting, you know, when you look at neoclassical architecture, there's a clear, distinct style of borrowing from ancient classic architecture in Rome. So this is a larger image of course, the Ionic capital that's being lifted into place. I just love to show students and people the, you know, the way things are actually constructed. Very daring because, you know, they're not wearing harnesses or there's very little scaffolding or handrails around these things. So to get a building built back then was really kind of a monumental task. Okay, so we mentioned the Beaux-Arts design. Let's talk about some design attributes. The style of grandeur, primarily, of course, in the city of Paris. Paris was a magical place. The architecture reflected the sort of exuberance and, of course, the style and the wealth and status that they did have roughly between 1600 and 1780, really the phase after neoclassical architecture. So, of course, emphatically symmetrical. We're going to talk about asymmetry, local symmetry. What is that? Pretty much Beaux-Arts architecture lends itself to axial conditions and the difference between containment of space versus defined space. So clearly, this is the penultimate example of Parisian Beaux-Arts architecture. Of course, the facade of Paris Opera House by Charles Garnier, obviously a French architect. You can see everything is decorated with some sort of incredible sculpture or just phenomenal detail. We'll talk about that a little bit more in depth in just a few minutes. Let's take a look at the relationship of symmetrical arrangements. Okay, so the bottom diagram, of course, is showing an emphatic symmetrical relationship. Now, there is what's called asymmetry in classical and Baroque and neoclassical and Beaux-Arts architecture. If you look at the diagram, the quick sketch at the top, now there is an asymmetrical relationship. However, there is a local symmetry. If you can see my cursor, the Great Temple front is symmetrical about a central axis. Then, of course, the building itself is not symmetrical, but the parts do have local symmetry. So when we take a look at the next image, the plan of the Parisian Opera House is that we see around the x-axis, of course, it is emphatically symmetrical about a central node. Then, of course, the y-axis does have asymmetry because, of course, the parts to the right break the symmetry of these facades. So when we talk about spatial dynamics in classical and Beaux-Arts architecture, we're talking about, if you look at the little yellow highlighted sections in the plan, we're talking about layering of space. Now, this is really the typology for larger urban buildings. This is, you know, of course, the typical plan for an opera house. Of course, this is to transition from the outdoor space in Paris and, of course, to the interior salons, of course, the actual theater. If you look at the part on the left, is that we have an exterior loggia, a transition space from piazza to the actual building. Then, of course, we have an enclosed loggia. We have two layers of transition spaces. Then, of course, there is another space between the interior loggia and, of course, the main grand staircase. We'll look at that a little bit more in detail, but these are just some really extraordinary sort of spatial dynamics, because you don't ever just open the door and see the theater in just one view. There's several different layers of spaces, of course, from exterior, then, of course, to the interior salons. Of course, we can see that this is a very heavy classical plan because, of course, the walls are load bearing. The spaces are what's called very contained because the massive walls clearly contain each spatial agenda. So this plan is an emphatic plan of very contained space. Let's take a look at that. We've seen the Paris Opera House. Let's take a look at, early modern architecture, roughly the 1915s to the 1920s. We talk about spatial definition. We're talking really about early modern architecture. This is Mies van der Rohe's studies for his early country house. Obviously with steel and concrete, we're able to free up architectural space. We're not using heavy load-bearing masonry walls to bury the structure and, of course, the spatial dynamics. Now, this is called a spatial definition or a spatial implication. You can look at some of these plans and see that Mies is not trying to contain space with massive masonry and stone and brick walls. Of course, with glass and steel, we can do something very dynamic with the spatial consideration. This is, definitely not Beaux-Arts. I'm just showing you kind of a major contrast from the spatial dynamics from steel and concrete, then of course to the load-bearing masonry walls. So we're looking at spatial definition, which I mentioned earlier, and spatial implications. So when we talk about classical architecture and neoclassical and Baroque and Beaux-Arts, is that we're seeing a very contained space. When we say contained space, and this of course is a different theater, but you can just imagine pouring plaster into each one of these chambers, especially the curved one. The plaster would dry, you could pull the entire negative space out as a positive in the plaster. So we talk about classical language of spatial dynamics. We're talking about a very heavy contained space. This is clearly not containment of space because we're using glass and little columns and planar elements to imply the spatial definition. Of course, we talked about the axial condition. When you look at Beaux-Arts plans or classical architecture, we see different multiple axes. Again, it's interesting that the materials of architecture really change the space. Remember, from ancient Rome, the Pantheon was built out of concrete. Then, of course, the Visigoths sacked the city of Rome. The formula for concrete was lost until 1850, when, of course, they introduced steel and concrete. So now steel and concrete really radically changes the spatial dynamics of architecture. This is a plan of course, my favorite plan. Of course, this is Fair Park in Dallas. What we're looking at is, it is a Beaux-Arts sort of site plan organization, because if you follow my cursor, we're looking at the entry is designed upon an emphatic axis, an axial condition. The famous esplanade with the water is on center with the entry. Then, of course, the centers aligned with each other. Then, of course, the main axis for all the buildings are centralized about a central axis. I could probably take my cursor and draw a center line from the stadium, project that further, and of course we can see the center of the intersection of the two streets would become, of course, the center or the spring point for all the other parts of the composition. So when we talk about formal language of design, we're talking about an axial condition, symmetry, and local symmetry. So we're not seeing that at all in modern architecture. So you can clearly see the classical language severely distinct from, of course, early modern architecture. Okay, so let's take a look at the building, the school itself, the famous École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Beautiful Arts. This is probably the most famous school of art and architecture in Paris. It started out with art, the fine arts. It didn't have architecture until the late 1700s. But let's take a look at the actual courtyard, the buildings. This, of course, is an engraving showing, this is a wonderful little fragment that's been removed. It's, I think, a French Renaissance chateau there. A little fragment of it made the entry portal from the exterior street and then, of course, to the main court. Of course, it's been removed since then. Now we're seeing the current day position of the courtyard. It's still an extraordinary building. Here's the plan, of course, a clearly Beaux-Arts plan of symmetry, and axial conditions. Now let's look at some of the pieces that form the courtyard. These are some of the original buildings in 1650. A lot of the parts were interestingly borrowed from French chateaus. So it wasn't just one building built at the same time. They kept adding fragments and pieces starting from 50 until the 1800s. So let's take a look at the early kind of French Renaissance and classical language that defined the courtyard spaces. We're looking at is heavy masonry walls from classical architecture. And of course, we're seeing small openings. Let's take a look at what's considered the modern building, the Beaux-Arts building built the 1700s. What we're looking at is larger expanses of glass. We have larger openings, a severe contrast to the smaller French Renaissance buildings that are there on the left and the right. But the way that we're able to make larger openings is because if you look at one of these famous French architects, Henry Lebouche, was saying cast iron and stone coming into play before we have modern steel. So with cast iron, this is just an example. Look how thin, I'm sorry, hold on a minute. Can you still see the full screen?
Yes, I can still see the full screen.
Look how thin the structure is for these incredible saucer-shaped domes. This is the famous Sainte Genevieve Library in Paris. I think this is roughly the 1700s by Henry Lebouche. He was a student in, of course, the Beaux-Arts, but with cast iron, we don't need heavy classical masonry marble column to support a roof structure. This is a very original, what's considered a modern sort of typology for architecture. So of course that comes into play in the actual design for the building that houses the School of the Beaux-Arts, originally a fine arts program. So the structure of it is the original 1600 building. Of course, it used to be an exterior court. Later in the 1700s, when they added architecture, they added this cast iron skeletal frame, which of course houses, of course, the main court. Now it's covered with steel and glass. We were not able to do this really definitely in neoclassical architecture because we didn't really have cast iron back then. So now we have a new material, cast iron. Of course, it's technically modern because we don't need heavy masonry columns to support the roof structure. But of course, it is classical and Baroque because we're still decorating. I'm sorry, I keep saying Baroque, I meant Beaux-Arts because we're still decorating the cast iron columns. So before we look at the building in detail, let's take a look at some painters. I love this image. Now this courtyard was filled because when they added the architecture program, they actually built full scale, what I'm calling mock-ups of some of the ancient temples. This is of course probably about a 60 or 70 foot tall section of the Parthenon in Greece. So the students would come to the courtyard, they would sketch and measure these elements. This courtyard is filled with classical, Hellenistic, archaic from ancient Greece, and of course, the classical language of architecture in these little pieces. The students would actually come out and measure and draw these things in sketchbooks and understand the proper proportioning. A really wonderful courtyard. Of course, this is not built with stone and marble. Of course, it is simply just plaster on chicken wire just because it's temporary installation, but really wonderful to see the proper scale of things back then. So again, I was saying that let's take a look at a very successful famous painter. It started out as a fine arts program before they had architecture. This is Jacques-Louis David's famous paintings. We see now this school was only able to accept very talented, serious painters. You can see Jacques-Louis's incredible layer and technique of what's called glazing and his brushstroke work. These are just really, of course, based on classical Renaissance paintings, and of course, Baroque. If you remember the term chiaroscuro from Baroque means dark and intensity of light and shade. So of course, he's taken the classical composition of classical Renaissance painting. You can sort of see the implied triangle. The swords point up to a central part, and of course, the figures sort of imply a triangle. You can see the Renaissance composition with, of course, Baroque coloring or intensity of light and shade chiaroscuro. Of course, as a student, you would be drawing these beautiful little preliminary drawings. These are studies for paintings. These are definitely not meant to be seen or framed in any sort of capacity. They're simply preliminary drawings. Of course, before modern painting and architecture, it was inappropriate to see preliminary stuff and brushstrokes. Of course, these lend themselves to really extraordinary just drawings in themselves. Now, these are just, of course, preliminary, but these artists and students just could draw like the original Renaissance and classical masters. So before we look at the rest of the architecture school, let's take a look at what was going on in terms of the drawing. In the program in the Beaux-Arts, you would be doing what's called analytical drawings. And so by analytical, I mean an analysis. It's interesting that we're looking at plan and section only. We're not looking at perspectival. It's interesting that when we talk about the study of architecture, particularly in the Beaux-Arts, you really rarely ever see a perspectival drawing. You're looking at a plan and section analysis because technically back then, and of course you remember from early modern architecture, Corbusier really doesn't do a lot of perspective drawings. They're really plan and section and some axonometric analysis. So these are beautiful, what's called analytic drawings that superimpose different plans and section to study the section and of course the proportions. This is an extraordinary book. It's called Architectural Shades and Shadows. So what they do is when they do renderings of buildings, they study what's called skyography, the art and science of properly constructing shades and shadows. This is very popular in Beaux-Arts. When we look at a Beaux-Arts rendering, we're seeing skyography on each one of the renderings. What that means is this particular artist or architect, Henry McGoodwin, this is an extraordinary book. I show it to my modern architecture students and they're just blown away because these are not drawn from observation. Nothing is eyeballed. Everything is carefully calculated with a system of solar angles, the azimuth and the bearing is plotted in a plan and then of course cast up in elevation to see the proper way that shadows particularly fall on objects and of course facades behind it. And these are just not meant to be beautiful, but the study and analysis is just extraordinary. For someone to manually calculate the shadows that fall on objects behind it, and of course the proper ratio of sunlight and shadows is really extraordinary. You know, of course we rely on digital software. The digital software is manual, of course, is drawing all the shades and shadows for you in the computer. But as a student, especially in the Beaux-Arts, you would not, of course, I didn't have computers, you would be manually calculating these. You could probably imagine hundreds of preliminary drawings to properly figure out how that curved shadow falls onto that curved space in the cross section here in one of the temple drawings. So no one ever just takes one piece of paper, draws from start to finish the final renders. We're looking at, you know, hundreds of investigation of how that shadow would properly fall. This is a very, very intense school of painting, art, and architecture. Only the strong, the very talented survive. Even Paul Cézanne, the famous modern painter, was turned down because, of course, his work was probably too radical and modern for the school. Okay, I'm kind of getting off the subject, but I just want to show you that this is, of course, the preliminary drawing you would be doing as a student there in the Beaux-Arts. So let's take a look at the final, what's called the analytic drawings from the Beaux-Arts. Obviously, we're looking at the proper calculation of shades and shadows. These are just extraordinary reconstruction drawings of classical buildings. And by reconstruction, I mean, you know, actually they would go out to Rome and measure some of the fragments and reconstruct the proper height and the proportion of the buildings. Because of course, most of the, if you go to the Roman Forum, in ancient Rome, you would see pieces of the building, you would never see a completely finished building. Of course, it was probably damaged by earthquakes and pillage. So the Beaux-Arts students would reconstruct the proper buildings in their original glory. And we see, sorry, I hate to keep seeing the PowerPoint labels, but you're seeing, you know, the students will be drawing decorative sculpture objects, decoration, the buildings. This is a wonderful picture of the students fully dressed. And this is probably the Beaux-Arts school roughly in the 1800s, because of course cameras came to play roughly in the 1850s. But you would be seeing students formally dressed. It's really interesting to see the attire of students back then. Of course, they were very professionally dressed. You would be painting in a nice tailored outfit. Interesting now when you go to schools, people have no sort of mindset of proper formal attire. I'm sure this, of course, is a staged photograph. I'm sure they, when they were painting, they probably wore some less formal clothing, but I thought that was an interesting picture of the way people dressed back then while they were working. So again, we're looking at renderings. Of course, really, the original term for rendering is it's really showing you a conceptual image of what the building would look like after it's finished. So rendering is really not to show the building. The rendering is really not to show after the building's finished, really to show what the building would look like if it's finished. But of course, you would be going to Rome, you would be drawing reconstruction drawings, you would actually properly scale and measure some of the ancient Roman temples, of course, to figure out the proper scale and proportion. These are just some wonderful preliminary drawings, just wonderful images themselves. Of course, here's a rendering from the Beaux-Arts school. So really in studying the Beaux-Arts architecture, of course, here's an extraordinary Analytical showing probably a detail of the facade of the Colosseum with a proper volute construction, not drawn from observation, definitely not eyeball, properly measured and scaled and properly calculated with the proper light and shade, which I just showed you before. This, of course, is a rendering, of course, McKim White. This is, of course, their renderings. They weren't at the École des Beaux-Arts, but of course, they borrowed their sort of drawing typology from the school. We see an incredible, extraordinary kind of what I'm saying, a very kind of overdone looking facade, beautifully rendered with light washes and shades and shadows. And they did tons of these. So especially the one on the right, they're actually properly drawing, if you remember from our classical moldings lecture a year ago, is that the proper ratio of the columnar order based on the Doric and again, the Corinthian order. They're probably showing the different sections, the number of diameters. But what I like to show is, these are beautiful renderings, but the most intriguing ones are the ones that are not deliberately finished, because you can see the sort of thought process, the drawing, especially the one on the right. So really, you're probably wondering, why would they do this course to study the classical language of architecture in a Beaux-Arts style? But really, this is sort of a tutelage and studying for applying for the major competence that was huge back then. We're going to be looking at, sorry, I'm losing my place. So ultimately, in doing and studying at the Beaux-Arts, you would be applying for the world-renowned, unbelievable competition, of course, the Prix de Rome Prize. And some of these students, Louis XIV actually commissioned students to design some of the work for, of course, his palace at Versailles and his other work. So these are students that actually went on to study and work for emperors in Louis XIV, 15th, and 16th. These students were so prolific and prominent that, of course, they actually got to meet Louis XIV and other emperors, of course, in Paris. But for the most part, we're looking at students that apply for the Rome Prize competition. So when you look at early sort of classical renderings, a lot of these drawings were done, especially if you look at Roman, these were actually done for the Rome Prize renderings, because the Rome Prize really furthered the study of classical architecture. And by that, what they did was they would go to Rome and they would actually reconstruct what I mentioned earlier as what the original temples that were seen in ruins physically in person. They would go back and redraw them to show the proper scale and, of course, the proportion of the actual building. So some of these were done for the Beaux-Arts school, and of course, most of these were done for the Prix de Rome Prize. You would study for about 3 years. You would live in, I think, Villa Medici before they moved it to the American Academy, the 1800s. So a lot of these drawings were done for the Beaux-Arts school and, of course, for their competition drawings for the Prix de Rome Prize. Of course, the Rome Prize is still there and active, and you can apply for it. So I'm just going to kind of show you kind of the ultimate example of Beaux-Arts architecture relative in the 1800s. We're looking at the Paris Opera House, designed by Charles Garnier in the 1800s. We're looking at what I'm saying, neoclassical architecture in a very overdone style. We're able to draw and construct all these extraordinary things, the sculptures. There's really nothing undecorated in this language. So let's take a look at just the main the main courtyard facade that faces the court. Of course, now there's bus terminals. Of course, the balustrade at the front goes down to the metro station. But we're looking at is we're still borrowing the language of architecture from classical Renaissance architecture. We see, if we look at the Campidoglio, the design for the Capitoline Hill by Michelangelo, we're seeing the giant order, which he introduced. Of course, we're seeing the small little columns that flank in between each one of the structural bays. You can see the paradigm for the Paris Opera House coming and borrowing from Michelangelo's facades. We see the large giant order above the piano nobile, and of course the small paired columns, which are actually gold leafed in Beaux-Arts architecture. It's interesting, you can see the correlation between Renaissance and, of course, Beaux-Arts architecture, because Beaux-Arts architecture is borrowing from classical and Renaissance themes. So when I say grandeur, I mean, it's exactly this sort of fantasy architecture. We only see this as renderings, but now we're able to build these things. It's a very popular style in Paris in the 1700s, 1800s. This is just extraordinary work. Now we have probably gas lanterns, possibly electric lanterns, but for our intents and purposes, these are probably oil and gas lanterns before they had electricity. But of course, this is just phenomenal the sort of fantasy architecture. We only see this roughly at the Palace of Versailles with the Hall of Mirrors. But everything is goldily. There's chandeliers. It's absolutely sort of this dramatic theatrical setting for architecture. Look at the grand staircase. This is really the first thing you would see before you would actually go to the theater and see the actual auditorium setting. So everything has a painting, a fresco, carving on the stone, the marble. If you actually go to either the Musée d'Orsay or the Museum of the Beaux-Arts, you see these incredible cross-section models. This is a digital rendering. The part on the left is showing you the section of the stage. Of course, these are large stage heads that pull up into the attic story of the buildings. These are just extraordinary cross sections. This is actually a scaled model, but look at the detail. Each section has its own contained space and section. The stairs are incredible. Everything has this unbelievable, what I'm calling an overdone sort of language of architecture. It's interesting that, of course, the basement or the crypt section doesn't really have a lot of decoration because, of course, you're showing the bones and the foundation of the building. So the public spaces are very overdone and ornately carved. This is actually the back of the parasol. I like to show the backs of the facade because some of them are a little bit more intriguing and rugged than the front, but we clearly see that every surface is carefully thought out, designed, and somewhat overly articulated. So we look at Beaux-Arts architecture, everything is somewhat overdone and over decorated. This is actually a building in my neighborhood. This is the old municipal building in Dallas in 1913, but we see that, we're not using a lot of plaster and wood, we're using marble and stone. Now, of course, this is architecture before pneumatic tools, so everything was carved by chisels and hands, but look at how highly polished. That's not a polyurethane, that is the burnishing of the marble in these columns. Of course, we're looking at McKean White's wonderful classical language. We see what's interesting. You can clearly identify this as a Beaux-Arts style because they're borrowing the tripartite arches from the ancient baths of Diocletian. Then, of course, each one of the arch niches has its own structural bay. The columns are paired between each bay. This is a very popular Beaux-Arts design style. It's to have the columns paired between each one of the windows. We see, of course, look how three-dimensional the facade is. It's kind of like a large ancient bath in classical antiquity from first century AD in sort of a kind of an exaggerated style. The cornice is it's not really proportioned for the building, it's really proportioned for the entire site, of course, the square that it faces. So these are urban buildings that are scaled in proportion for the city itself, not just for the actual building, because look how large the cornice is. It's really kind of overscaled. Of course, you remember the proportions for the Corinthian order are very much larger than, of course, Doric and Ionic and Corinthian orders. The interior is just as fascinating. It's interesting what we do with the typical classical vaulting. We see the structural piers. Probably we're using cast iron, not steel, and not completely relying on the masonry, but we're seeing a very heavy classical floor plan. What's interesting is that McKean does with layering of space. It's not just the structural piers, is that the interior has porosity. The interior screen walls, which of course are layered with the Ionic order. Of course, we see the Greek balusters, not profile baluster. We see the perforated Greek key design and the balusters and the handrail. It's interesting relationship of the solid masonry peels with kind of the open, defined spatial colonnade in between each one of the spaces. There's a wonderful little detail. It's interesting that the exterior is very kind of ornate and somewhat overly designed. The interior has some sort of restraint. This is a detail of course, each one of these curvilinear arch colonnades, a very delicate egg and dart pattern around the what's called the architrave. The architrave, of course, is the arch detail around the large arched opening. Of course, this is New York City in the 1800s. We're going back to, I think this is the Garden Palace there in Paris, but we're seeing a very overdone style of architecture. It's almost kind of what Le Corbusier, the modern architects, referred to in Baroque and Beaux-Arts style in Rome, and Paris is at the architecture of the grotesque. There is just sculpture in detail everywhere, but of course parts of it are restrained because we see the delicate bracketing around the architrave, which of course starts as the horizontal proportion and of course adorns the entire arch around the opening. But of course we're looking at heavy, overly designed ionic columns with festoons and floral motifs around everything. Now, this is definitely a far step above neoclassical. You would never really see this sort of overdone language in neoclassical architecture because everything is florid. There's cherubs, and we're celebrating the craft and the possibilities of any sort of sculptural detail you could kind of imagine in the sort of the Belle Epoque era in Paris, of course, due to the Beaux-Arts style. This is, of course, is the plan of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We're seeing an emphatic symmetrical relationship on the main facade, and of course the y-axis has asymmetry to it, but we're seeing a very emphatic classical symmetrical arrangement and plan. So I'm just going to kind of go back to some of the earlier compositional strategies. You can clearly see that the Beaux-Arts plan style does have an emphatic center to it. Of course, if you look at Beaux-Arts plans, especially opera houses, the walls are very heavy and load-bearing. You can clearly identify this as a Beaux-Arts plan because everything has a columnar order associated with every single layer. The same thing with the facades on, of course, the École de Beaux-Arts, especially the plan. I just thought that was an interesting relationship about the way you can do structure, because if this is a neoclassical enclosure, you would see heavy classical marble and stone columns that support the roof structure. But now we have cast iron, so we can free up the spatial dynamics, have as much amount of glass as possible. You know, I teach, again, modern architecture at UTA, and I would love for my students to be wearing a professional level. So, I mean, people come in with their pants pulled down and their colorful underwear hanging out, and it's just really a little bit discouraging that I'm going to take you seriously as an architecture or a painting student. But I just thought this was an interesting photograph. Well, I think it's about 12:40. Those are all the images that I have for now. Do you guys have any questions or comments? I can stop at each one of the slides and give some more detail. I'll just kind of leave this one up for thoughts and questions. Now, Valerie, do you have any questions or?
I don't think I have questions right now. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
I had a quick question. This is Raphael from Houston.
Yes.
So the Beaux-Arts school doesn't exist anymore. Is that correct?
It does as a fine arts program only. They actually dropped the architecture program because of the riots at the Sorbonne, and I think it ended in 1968.
Okay,
They don't have architecture, because when I won the Gabriel Prize and visited there, I kept wanting to see the architecture studios, but they just have, they have painting, sculpture, and they have composition, not architecture. Yeah, but that is a shame that they don't have architecture.
Because I imagine that the prominence of the Beaux-Arts style or movement kind of hit the wall of modernism. I mean, I'm assuming that's what made it start falling off.
Yeah, actually Louis Sullivan, the modern architect that we looked at last week, he was actually a teacher there for about a year, and then I think he left because he wanted to pursue modern architecture. He didn't want to keep doing, the Beaux-Arts classical language. But there's several different, and I think Auguste Perret that did the early concrete buildings in Paris, he was a teacher there as well, but left.
Because I think famously Louis Kahn was trained in the Beaux-Arts, but as he put it, he tried to forget it as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that, some of the schools have their own sort of ideology. I'm sure, the Beaux-Arts design school, you have to remember the classical language, otherwise it wouldn't let you in. We actually applied and went to what's called the modern school, the Bauhaus, by Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe. It's like they told you to forget everything you learned in architecture and art. And so this is kind of the new regime of modern architecture. So of course, each school has their own sort of pedagogy. When I was applying for my master's in architecture, I wanted to live and study in New York City. I just wanted to be in New York City. I wanted to study architecture at Columbia, but I went to the school and it was a computer science lab. There were no models, there were no drawings. I couldn't really do that. That's why I went to University of Virginia. They combined hand-built work, of course, with digital work. That's what's so great about that school.
So do you think that you kind of described the exuberant style of the Beaux-Arts and how it tended to have layer upon layer of decoration? I mean, does that end up setting up the reaction that modernism was able to take advantage of, because it I think people were just tired of the overproduced architecture.
Well, yeah, but because especially if you remember, I talked about the Chicago's World Fair that Louis Sullivan designed some of the main buildings for, is that World's Fair, the Columbian exhibition, all the buildings were in the Beaux-Arts style. And so the entire world of architecture wanted to see a new style because, of course, this is the turn of the century. They didn't want to keep reinstating the sort of classical language because we have steel. They were saying, I cast around and said, why would we want to keep building in a sort of formal style when we have steel to sort of change the spatial dynamics? That's kind of why Louis Sullivan won the competition to rework the entire city after the fire of Chicago, because of course people saw that his work was original. They wanted an original new style for the turn of the century. I think that's kind of why everyone had this sort of version to a new century in a kind of an older sort of classical language. But of course, I mean, I can't imagine Paris without work like this. I mean, Paris is a magical city. You would want to see the most exaggerated, extraordinary, overdone language. I think this is just fantastic. But of course, some architects would consider this wedding cake architecture, because there's so much frosting, it's so overdone. But still, I mean, in parts of history, it is still extraordinary language of construction and building. Of course, this is before we had power tools, but for people to carve and imagine this is just, I think, really extraordinary. It isn't really personally my favorite style, but again, it's just the evolution of decorative styles over history. Yeah.
Well, to me, what's so interesting about this time period is they were still innovating. I mean, when you see that library, the St. Genevieve Library by Le Bruce,
oh, well, yeah,
that is very innovative, obviously still in the kind of decorative style, but still moving architecture forward. Part of me wonders what would have happened if that kind of train of thought continued.
Well, yeah, because you can see the library right now. I mean, this was unprecedented. I mean, you can imagine walking in Paris in the late 1700s and seeing, I mean, no one had ever seen a thin little column like that, especially architects. I mean, I'm sure the other architects were probably very jealous of how original and innovative this was, because those columns are, I mean, because with cast iron, I mean, now I'm looking at them and thinking, how are those still being held up? So yeah, this was very innovative. Of course, fortunately, the cast iron language transferred into, of course, the Crystal Palace by Joseph Paxton, and then of course into, I think America really embraced the new cast iron modern style more than probably Paris did. But yeah, this is just, I mean, look at that spatial dynamic.
It makes me, kind of reminds me of even Penn Station, which we looked at previously, of these, large spaces that were still highly decorative, but were using the new technology. Was it still cast iron at that time, or would that have been steel?
If it was after 1850, because the Bessemer process that manufactured steel was roughly the mid 1850s. So they did have a steel frame behind that, because I think I'm looking at this building. I think this might have been by McKimmey and White, is that you see obviously a steel frame behind that. So yeah, I think Penn Station had to have steel. Yeah, because it's really interesting that I wish I had an image of Penn Station, but they used steel and probably they were using concrete, because there's no way you would be able to do a large brick vaulting system like that without concrete.
Yeah.
Steel, but yeah, this is probably not used with concrete. This is actually steel. I just think this is a fascinating photograph to show, it's a classical language. It's decorative, but we're still, covering up the steel frame, because of course, Society Interactive is not ready to show a steel frame. And also they didn't have the capabilities to finish out a purely glass and steel frame. How would you flash it? You weren't able to do large plate glass, but those are interesting questions. I just think that the material change really radically changed architectural space and of course structure. Now, obviously, we're not using steel at all. This is probably iron rods, probably not cast iron columns, because of course this is, I think, the early 1800s. So they weren't really building with cast iron as an exposed structure that was probably concealed behind the columns. So this is really, I think, really very original and unique for architecture. I think this is probably 1790s. Because I think this architect said it's time to, embrace the structural capacities of cast iron without having a heavy masonry marble column. Of course, it's not really modern, because we're still, you look at some of the details, those are still Ionic capitals. So the cast iron is still decorative at this point.
Jay, I just saw that someone asked a question in the comment section.
Yes. You might have to, I can't see all the questions on my end.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll just read it to you. It's quite interesting that the Beaux-Arts building doesn't fully exemplify the architectural philosophy. And now the question is, were there plans to continue embellishing the school building itself, or was it that the Beaux-Arts philosophy continued to expand as the students learned and created?
Yeah, I think, you mean just in terms of the school itself and the philosophy? Well, what's interesting is that, they dropped the architecture programs, but so for years, I mean, even to this day, they're still, continuing the philosophy of the classical language. Because if you go to that school, I mean, you would do some sort of modern painting and sculpture, but, it's still continuing the tradition of the classical ideology and language of painting and drawing. If that answers your question. Because it clearly did not continue as a flourishing architecture program. If it were to do that, then of course, if the architecture school was still today, then they still would not be doing modernism. They would still be doing probably Beaux-Arts architecture. If that answers their question.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Maybe another way to think of it is that the neoclassical style or movement kind of started out chaste, and over the years through the Beaux-Arts, it became more Baroque, if you will.
Yeah.
Similarly, as the Renaissance started out very chaste and went through kind of the more classical period, and then the Mannerist period, and the Baroque period. The Beaux-Arts, or the neoclassical period, did the same thing.
Right. I kind of imagine when I talked about Baroque architecture, I just thought, well, imagine the entire city of Rome as everything was Baroque, it would almost be visibly disgusting to see curves and waves everywhere. That was a very distinct, particular time and place to even do that. Because you can, I mean, if you can imagine, you can imagine if the entire state of Rome was this, it would just be like, it would just be visual information overload. It would be so hard to even really digest everything. It's kind of just like eating desserts for every meal.
I mean, in a sense, the modern movement has done the same thing. If you start out with the work of Mies and end up with the work of Frank Gehry or some of the people that are doing it today, it's the same kind. It's the same type of turn of seasons from chaste to very exuberant.
You know, it's interesting you said it, because I think architecture, like everything else, goes in phases. You know, because now we're in a neo-Baroque phase. I'm sure the contemporary avant-garde architects wouldn't like to admit that. But, you know, Frank Gehry's work and Zaha Hadid and all the sort of wavy digital stuff, it's still a visible Baroque language. Like, what's disturbing about that is that there's really no clear organizing strategy. If you look at Baroque architecture, there is a very ordered plan about a symmetrical axis. There's clear ellipses and curves to form the compound geometry. But now the avant-garde architects just put everything, because when I was in graduate school, I did this software where the software determined the form for you, which I thought was very disturbing. Why would you want computer software to determine all your design decisions? And then when I look at Frank Gehry's work, which of course is what I'm considering the neo Beaux-Arts Baroque style, is like everything is a curvilinear form. It's really hard to even understand any sort of poetic about the spatial agenda. I think it's visibly exciting, but I think it's gross. There's really no underlying strategy or composition. It's exciting. I love it. It's like the video game architects, like eating, you know, a wedding cake for every meal, but you would not want to see that for every single building. And just think that it's a little bit naive. That, of course, I certainly don't have projects of that caliber at all whatsoever. But I just think that, you know, a lot of people think, oh, it's the new wave. It is the new wave of architecture, but is it really going to sustain itself, continuing in that sort of style? That's almost like, you know, having this style, which you can see the image of the it's actually, I think, the large greenhouse in Paris. But if everything continuing in this style, it would be a little bit kind of grotesque to keep building in this sort of language and style. That's just my opinion, but it's interesting that you brought some of the contemporary avant-garde artists or architects up, because, you know, it's just getting way beyond any sort of poetic of space or sort of compositional strategy. It's a new, exciting intent, but I'm not sure it's really going to sustain itself by serious historians and contemporary architects. But I'm probably going to get fired for saying that, but you know, that's just an opinion.
Raphael had asked if what would it be like if the Beaux-Arts had continued, or, you know, if it hadn't, or if the Beaux-Arts school had continued on. I think if you look at Bertram Goodhue's work, he was trained at the Beaux-Arts and kind of through the 30s created a different style, but it still had the same ordering and
well, you said Bertram Goodhue.
Yeah,
it's interesting because, you know, he did mostly Gothic cathedrals, neo-Gothic. It's
well, I'm Bertram Good. I'm thinking about the state houses that he did in the Midwest.
Well, yeah, I mean, Beaux-Arts architecture does exist in small pockets. I mean, because I'm in Dallas, and you look at George Dahl's Art Deco buildings, there is a Beaux-Arts plan. I think I showed that to you. Of course, it's not done in a visibly literal Beaux-Arts sense, but it does have Beaux-Arts sensibilities. If you look at the slide, you can see that the plan strategy is, of course, a Beaux-Arts alignment of centers and rotations. But of course, it's, you know, not visibly, it's actually Art Deco. Yeah. But I think Beaux-Arts architecture does continue in small little pockets.
It's just interesting if you look at the last couple of years of the Rome Prize
Right.
work, it was becoming, it was getting away from the over embellishment that you're kind of talking about, and it was turning into something new.
Well, yeah, because now the Prix de Rome Prize is a completely different animal. It's mostly kind of this ethereal, experiential imagery of art and not really architecture. I mean, because you would not be doing these images in the Rome Prize today, which I find not really a little bit sad, because I've seen some of the recent work at the Rome Prize, and it's this sort of very ethereal, kind of abstract, cerebral stuff that only the artists really understand and aren't really able to explain it in terms of professional level craft. I think it's a great prize, but the work I've seen recently is very different, somewhat a little bit disturbing. But of course, I'm very biased because I love classical architecture and the strategy, the organization. I think that in my training, a truly modern architect remembers the past and looks to the future. Now, what they're doing now is they're forgetting the past and just going to the future with no sort of ideology, theory, or strategy. It's a little bit too personal. So when I look at contemporary architecture and artists, well, specifically in the Rome Prize, I see a very, very personal language and a little bit too emotional, and it's really hard for anyone else to kind of understand, and it's even a certain level of craft or poetic, but I'm glad you brought that up. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's the whole point of the ICAA experiment and the work at Notre Dame, and is to rebirth these things that were thrown out and
right. And I think I mentioned, yeah, but 10 years ago, I won the Gabriel Prize, which is named after Jean-Jacques Gabriel, one of the main architects in Paris. And so he really established that foundation because, like, this 20 or 30 years ago, he noticed when he visited architecture schools that there was a lack of knowledge of history and the drawing abilities were diminishing. And this is probably in the 80s or 90s. And so I won the award in 2009. And so I could clearly see that a lot of my classmates didn't know the difference between Bernini or Borromini. They didn't know the Industrial Revolution was a huge difference between Renaissance. And I thought, well, that is really disturbing to go through your entire architecture career and not know the main difference and understand that. So, and the fact that the Gabriel Prize winners, they still love to draw. The phenomenon there is passion and love to draw. These people were not just interns, they loved architecture and painting and drawing. That's what's great originally about these two awards, the Gabriel Prize and of course the Rome Prize. Passionate about drawing and painting. I mean, yeah. I still do working drawings by hand, and a lot of the contractors are thinking, what are you talking about? You pick up a pencil? So drawing is a way of communication. It's a means to an end. It doesn't really matter. Of course, now if I couldn't imagine doing all the working drawings of this project by hand. That would be insane. The computer does make your life easier as a construction drawing technique, not as a design tool, only as a construction drawing tool. Well, I think I've divulged some very personal biases I probably shouldn't have, but I'm just kind of here to educate you on architecture. But when I was doing the research, you can imagine being at the École des Beaux-Arts and having Louis XIV commission you to do some of the work on some of his palaces. I mean, I would die to have a project like that.
One of the things I was struck with, I was reading somewhere that even some of the the winners of the Rome Prize, after they went to Rome and did their thing, and they were at the height of their career, a lot of them came back, and their lifetime job would be to be responsible for some bridge or water work out in the country somewhere.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting.
It wasn't so glamorous.
Oh, well, yeah, it really depends on who you meet after the school and what you do with it. Yeah, because I mean, I've had students that they've gone to Columbia, they've gone to Harvard, and they graduate, they work in an office, they're still doing window flashing details for 15 years because they're very comfortable doing that. But,
Yeah,
if you're ambitious, you're going to go a little bit further than that.
you would hope so.
Right. Because I know I have some very, well, I guess some very pragmatic colleagues that they're completely happy with being pigeonholed into one thing because they get health insurance benefits, they get a regular paycheck, which is fine. But those are people that really aren't that ambitious. They're really not passionate about architecture. They're skilled, they have qualifications, but it's just depending on how far you want to take your career and what you want to do with your degrees. Mhm. Well, it is only 1 o'clock. I'm sure we have other questions. I was going to say, I'm not sure if, I think I found this on, I think Instagram or Pinterest, but, when I look at buildings like this, obviously during the 50s and 60s, I was mentioning the Holocaust of classical architecture. They just kind of try to eradicate anything that was classical. They wanted to further and streamline everything to make it modern. But when someone, takes a bulldozer to something like this, do they have any idea the work that was involved in getting to this point? I mean, you have to have a master craftsman, a master draftsman, a designer, and then someone to convey to the construction company how to build this thing. When somebody takes a bulldozer, I just think it's absolutely criminal to do that. And this is just one column. It looks like there must have been 40, you know? So a lot of people think that hand drawing in classical architecture is dead. I mean, I think it's more prolific now because we have, of course, the Classical Institute. We have many really prominent classical architects that are doing probably some nicer work that classical architecture existed in the 60s and 70s. I mean, classical architecture and hand drawing only dies if you let it. But we have wonderful organizations like this to continue this so it doesn't fall apart. I mean, I'm just going to throw these again. I mean, can you imagine the difficulty in constructing even something like this? I mean, Henry McGoodwin, do you realize how difficult it is to actually draw this? I mean, my students barely, now I hate to say this, but their attention span is so short that for them to even draw this without measuring, it would be a monumental task. These are done before digital marketing and distractions and Instagram. There was a time where people focused on their work and had a goal. And I'm not saying people don't have a goal now, but to do work like this, you had to be very, very focused. It must have taken a long time to actually manually do this, but look at what someone's capable of doing. because, a lot of my students, now, well, in modern architecture, they can barely even add square footage. I have to tell them how to actually do that. And some of them don't even know that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. I'm not kidding, it is a very different world. Of course, they can't read manual clocks at all. They're so used to seeing the world of digits that I have to show them how to read the long and, of course, the short dials on a clock. Okay, well, Valerie, are there any other questions or comments?
Sorry, I was in the wrong window.
No,
There's
that's
one
fine.
more question.
Sure.
So do we know why the founder began the school, and what was his goal for the architectural side? Did he accomplish it?
I think I'm not sure of the beginnings. I think the founder, that's a good question. I think he wanted to further the classical language of architecture at this time. I think he was founded by Cardinal Mazarin. There are some wonderful benevolent individuals. Of course, I think it was something like the Medici family were patrons of the arts and wanted to further these really extraordinary, like in the Renaissance, of course. Remember, the Medici family, hired Caravaggio and all these incredible, Michelangelo and Brunelleschi, these extraordinary individuals to further and intensify the language of art and architecture. I think this person did almost kind of the same thing in the 1600s. I'm not really sure why it was founded, but it was so big that, this was the most famous school of art and architecture in the world. But that's a good question. I'm not really sure why he did this or why it was founded. But if you remember from the Gabriel Prize, the founder was a very wealthy, benevolent benefactor and wanted to further the education of classical architecture. It might have been the same condition that this individual did. But so that's a good question. I'm not really sure I have a definite answer for you. But I think in terms of the space, I think there was a large, probably a courtyard that was already existing. And then of course, I think Cardinal Mazarin probably owned the property and built the buildings around that to house the studios for the school. Of course, it's on Rue Bonaparte, the famous square street in Paris. It's interesting. Yeah, I think you can see this drawing of the drapery. Again, this is just simply an exercise to study the three-dimensional quality of drapery. This is never intended to be framed or definitely not shown in the gallery whatsoever. It's a precursor, a preliminary drawing for something like this. But now people's taste in artwork is vastly different. This is still an incredible. I would frame this and put it in my house. It's still a wonderful investigation of light and shade in three-dimensional quality. It's interesting that the phases of art and people's taste really radically change. I'd rather see this than something like probably this, because this is very unpretentious and natural and just honest about the drawing quality, the study, than something like this. Then I think again in terms of the painting school, I think a lot of people don't really understand how an oil painting is done with glazes. What you do is you would do an underpainting like this on the canvas, you would lightly go back and tint the colors. Then you would go back and what's called an oil glaze, a thin layer of different colors. You would actually technically be tinting the drawing. So without understanding how to properly paint, what we're looking at is people that mix all the colors together to make the flesh color, mix pink and peach and red to make the flesh tone, not really understand that you don't have to go through all that process to make a figure look three-dimensional. There's gray tones in a glaze. A glaze is a thin liquid mixture of color and of course tint and oil. And then you can, it's essentially taking like a layer in Photoshop and kind of tinting it. But now, students, they think that there is these incredible painters that don't understand the proper techniques. So I'm looking at, and of course, these are proper techniques, phenomenal. But I think if you look, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So the oil was laid down just like a watercolor wash?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. Like in other words, this would be drawn and modeled. By modeling, I mean shaded with, you can use graphite or you would use a thin layer of gray oil wash. In other words, this entire composition was laid out preliminary on the canvas like this. Then, of course, Jacques-Louis David would make a mixture of oil and, of course, the pigment, a diluted amount of pigment onto the painting to sort of tint the colors. So in other words, like let's say the figure on the left, let's take a look at the purple shading. You would not mix a mixture of black paint on the purple. You would use it as a kind of a thin sort of gray, black, thin layer of oil glaze and apply to show the modeling. You would not mix the purple paint with the black pigment, be added on later. But when people start painting, they don't understand how to properly paint something in 3 dimensions. So what I'm looking at is a really terrible poor excuse for a technique when they, if you understand how to properly paint, you can avoid these really awful sort of, these, well, now, because when you look at painting, I love to see brush strokes painting because it's a very different technique. But, back then it would be very, unprofessional and crude to show brush strokes. Everything had to be smoothed out perfectly to make for a proper painting. But yes, this painting looked like this originally before color was applied to it. And these were techniques that Renaissance architect used, of course, definitely continued into the Beaux-Arts painting school.
So was that part of the scandal when guys like Matisse and Monet started?
Yeah, because they, introduced what's called impressionistic painting. They got tired of seeing the classical modeling and painting from the Renaissance. And they said, what's wrong with showing brushstrokes and the true character of the paint? I think that's why Cezanne was turned down at the Beaux-Arts school, because he definitely was not about to do this. Of course, they were modern painters.
But even their technique was different.
Yeah, of course it was, because they weren't doing oil glazes. They were actually just painting without mixing that stuff together as just the true paint and pigment on the canvas. This is, they could paint like this, but the same thing with the Beaux-Arts style. People in the world got tired of seeing an overdone decorative style of architecture. The same thing with painting, because now in the 1850s, we have cameras, which of course you can depict the world as exactly exists. Why do we need to keep painting realistic subjects when we just take a picture? And of course, the artist's paintbrush can show a different poetic than, of course, without relying to realistic sort of subjects or painting techniques.
Wow.
Interesting that the camera, the same thing with steel and architecture, the camera in art and painting really changed the difference between classical painting and modern painting. Because now what the camera can show what the world really looks like without painting it to look like an actual photograph. So now, of course, these early artists, the early modern artists, were saying, okay, we can use a camera. Why can't we show the painting as somewhat abstract? So when we look at Mies van der Rohe's plans, he's already done, of course, by this time, Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe could, of course, drawn, let me go back to this, plans of a modern nature. I'm sorry, I'm losing my place just a moment. Mies van der Rohe, Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Sullivan could, of course, draw plans like this. They've already done that in school. But by now, they're saying with steel, why do we have to keep building in heavy masonry classical language? Because they would consider this to be a complete lie about the structure. Why can't we show the true nature, the structural capacity without having heavy masonry walls? The same with the daguerreotype in the late 1800s, 1850s. Now we can depict the world in reality with a camera, with an actual photograph. We can start experimenting with different painting styles and techniques without having to paint it like a photograph. That's what's original about the work. So if you really want to understand the future of painting in classical sense, I would look at what's called the underpainting. The underpaintings are a lot more far interesting than the final formal version. Because I think a lot of modern architects, or sorry, painters would consider this to be very formal, overdone, over-rendered, and prissy. The same thing with this. This is extraordinary, but you can sort of build the same language of this vocabulary. And you know, that's not my personal observation. Those are just facts that I've been reading in books for the 49 years I've been on Earth and painting and drawing architecture. Because, you know, when I look at, you know, Instagram artists, I think Instagram is great. I'm on it all the time. I'm popular. I have like, I think 1,500 followers. What I've noticed is that I'm considering them what's called fake artists. They do these funky abstracts. I have no compositional ideas. I have no technique. They have 1 million followers. They're wealthy. That's great. But they can't even imagine how to properly show modeling the three-dimensional quality between dark and light, because they haven't been trained. They don't want to be trained. They're built their entire career of people giving them compliments on Instagram. And I think that's a real cop out to say that you're a contemporary artist, but you can't really even paint or draw a realistic still life, a bowl of fruit. To me, that is just a huge cop out. And you're really sure. Yes, you can, you know, be $1 million popular, but eventually, I think one artist and architect said, you're always going to be a child if you don't know your origins as a kid. The same thing with Le Corbusier's statement about modern architecture. A truly modern person remembers the future, so remembers the past and looks to the future. So I'm looking at Frank Gehry and the funky digital artists. They're not even remembering the future. They don't want to. They don't remember the past. They want to be in the future and forget about everything, which is fine, but it's a phase that will die out. Because we don't, when I visit a Frank Gehry building, I think his work is great. It's exciting. He's amazing, but I kind of treat it like an amusement park ride. It's like you're on it one time. Do I want to go back to it again and again? Probably not. I'm going to show this to you real quick on my, I think we're running out of time, but I just think this is interesting. Let me see. I'm going to show you this one. I think this is such a great, exciting building for Dallas. We don't really have a lot of, you know, great modern architecture, but this, I'm sure you've seen this before, the Pro Science Museum. Can you see that on my Google page? Can you see that?
Yes, we can see it.
So, you know, I talked to modern architecture about this particular building. A lot of people think it's ugly. Well, I mean, you know, it has some sort of bizarre visible attributes, but it's a very exciting building. But again, you know, it's designed by Morphosis, a firm in Los Angeles, but it does have, of course, it starts out with a very clear organizing strategy. There's a cube. It's a modified cube with this diagonal escalator, which of course affords views towards the city of Dallas. It's almost the same thing with the Pompidou Center, that escalator on the facade does show views, of course, of the city. It's not a building to be appreciated or experienced on the outside. It's really an internalized program. I'm going to show this to you. Let me see if I can find the interior spaces. Okay, so this is why I'm always drawn to modern, or I'm sorry, classical or early modern, because let's look at the interior. Okay, really exciting, great, fabulous. Every time I go into this building, I'm always confused about where to go, because architecture in our world gives a certain order, because I think architecture is space, form, light, and clearly order. So when I walk into this building, I'm never really sure where I'm supposed to be or where to go. There's all these arbitrarily placed escalators and stairs and elevators. It's exciting, but then once you get in there, it's like, okay, so I go up to the interior spaces look like these really kind of dioramas on acid. I mean, it's really wonderful as a kid to go there, but what I'm saying is I just don't really see a clear ordering of parts, a clear strategy, a clear entry sequence, a clear place to aspire to going into these buildings. So when I look at classical architecture, there is a clear ordering of parts. There's a layer of space, which I showed you in, of course, the Parisian Opera House, but it's very disorienting and it's visibly exciting. I love it. I'd love to just get away from the world and go in there and just be completely moved. But then again, there's really very little poetic of space. I don't see where there's a stopping point. It's almost just like attention deficit disorder in a three-dimensional form. It's great for contemporary architecture, but I just don't think I would never have any students to analyze this entry in any capacity, because they would never, it's so far off outside the envelope, they would never understand the certain poetic or the clarity. But of course, it does look like you're going into a large cloud. It's almost like the sort of early Baroque architecture. But of course, again, in Baroque architecture, there still is a clear ordering of parts. It's a very hybrid geometry. But in this instance, it's very confusing and it's very hard to understand. And I remember Tom Mang saying that when he designed this, he hadn't looked at a floor plan in 15 years. I kept thinking, well, obviously not, because without a plan, what Le Corbusier says, you have a very severe lack of order. So, but it is exciting and wonderful and really magical. But I just think the order is missing. The hierarchy of spaces is missing. I can't figure out where to go. I'm not sure what to do, where to stand. Then, of course, the lobby, there's these cafeterias. I mean, you don't see the Metropolitan Museum of Art by McKean White with chairs and flowers everywhere. It's interesting, but it's very confusing. And I certainly don't have projects of this caliber whatsoever. But as a teacher and somewhat of a novice at history, as I just really find this spatial dynamic very frustrating and totally disorienting. But then, of course, to get some clarity, I go back to the original form, the cube, which has been adulterated by the diagonal, which is fine. Then we get to the ground plane. These kind of very warped looking, these are actually roofs of landscape. Of course, this is really designed due to the computer software really warping and sort of distorting everything. So it's kind of like art in sort of an acidic level. It's like the anamorphism of the cube in art. This enormous staircase, which is a little bit problematic as an entry point, because the stair is so big, you get into a very small landing. It doesn't really acclimate itself to this. These are stairs for a large public municipal building. Then you transfer into the really short little opening, which is interesting as a spatial compression because the ceiling is short. But then we get in there and we still get a very confusing entry sequence. But would I want to see this building in Paris or Rome? No. Would I want to see it in Dallas? Yes, because it is exciting and very original for Dallas. I could see this in New York, Los Angeles, but I just couldn't see it in the context of Paris or Rome at all. Because it literally would be taken out of context. Okay, well, Valerie, I think that's all I have. Does anyone have any other questions?
I don't see any further questions.
Okay, I hope I didn't confuse everyone. I just kind of give some partial objective and subjective observations.
Yeah, I think this was great. Thank you.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Okay, I will see you guys next Tuesday, and then Valerie, I will see you later.
Sounds good. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Bye-bye.